I don't have an outline, but I have a very simple structure that might help you to know where we're going. So it's 3 key points. The first point is about evangelical households in the 19th century. The second thing we're going to look at is at the Marsden household, and particularly the marriage, family and ministry of the Marsdens. Thirdly, we're going to look at the Hassall household, and same thing, their marriage, their family and their ministries. So that's the overall structure if you want to jot it down. I just wanted to say too, like some of the research that I did, I was doing research on the Sunday schools, the early Sunday schools, and meanwhile I was too a fellow at the Anglican Deaconess Ministry, so I have to give honour to them for helping fund the research. So I wanted to look at evangelical households in New South Wales in the early colony. And I always have this conviction that church history should help us in our ministry today. So I do want to make it kind of relevant to think about not just what happened in the past, but what kind of implications or challenges to our own thinking might come from our history. So this paper will raise issues, I hope, like how does a household do ministry together? Historians often focus very much on the man. So focus on, William Wilberforce or John Wesley or Martin Luther. But when we look at those men, they're within families, within households. And I want us to think about, okay, what was the role of the wife and the children in that ministry? It's going to raise questions about the role of women in marriage. It's a particular historical context, and as Danny has warned us, historical contexts are contingent, and our context is very different from the colony in New South Wales, obviously. But we will see in that women's ministry took a very different form, and also a little bit of change over time. So I'm hoping this paper will inspire and challenge you. So I'm going to focus on 2 different households. There was, first of all, Samuel and Eliza Marsden. The second one is the household of Thomas and Anne Hassall and their children. The Marsden and Hassall families were actually joined together when Thomas Hassall married Samuel's eldest daughter, Anne. These families had many different children and married other evangelicals. Many of them became ministers and missionaries and played significant roles in the colonial society in New South Wales. In fact, the Hassall dynasty itself is incredible. It still influences people today. There are many Christians who are descendants today of Thomas Hassall. Wondering if anyone here is... Yay! I'm married. There you go.
And your boss is Mike Dicker?
And Mike Dicker, my boss, his, I have to get this right, great-great-great-grandfather was Thomas Hassall. So that love of kids and youth ministry, which we'll find in Thomas Hassall, has gone down the line. How cool is that? So let me start with looking at evangelical households in the late 18th century, early 19th century. So I want to look at the context of the day as the historical contingency of what was happening. Marriage and family life in the 19th century was very different from today. And in particular, the ministry families had a very particular vision and goal in their household and their marriages and with their children. Historians like Stuart Piggin have talked about the evangelical vision to convert and civilise. This really shaped their ministry and the ministry of their household. They wanted to civilise and convert both individuals but also their society. And evangelicals like William Wilberforce, John Newton, Hannah More and Charles Simeon particularly gave voice to this vision of wanting to civilise and convert. Stuart Piggin and Robert Linder, in their book, The Fountain of Public Prosperity, explained that the evangelicals were both reformist and conversionist. They were concerned about social issues. The most famous is the abolition of slavery. But they were also interested in education of the poor, in missionary activity at home and abroad, and prison reform, which is kind of related to the colony of New South Wales as well, because we were initially a colony of criminals. What they tried to do is to build up a Christian community, Christian society, and therefore to further God's kingdom as he redeems his world and as it heads toward the millennium. So the colony of New South Wales was an experiment, according to the evangelicals, and they really saw ministry in the colony as a way to bring the gospel to the world. They even said, we can even bring the gospel to the Antipodes, that is Australia. William Wilberforce himself recruited Samuel Marsden to send him to New South Wales. And Thomas Hassall's father, Roland, was also converted by evangelical preaching and was sent as a missionary to the South Seas and ended up in Tahiti. He was sent by the Evangelical London Mission Society, or the LMS. The Marsden and Hassall households, we'll see, were both particularly concerned for the children of the colony, both Aboriginal children and children of convicts and the poor. They were eventually tempted to give up on the parents of these children because they believed that the parents were kind of resistant to civilization and conversion. So they focused their attention very much on the children, on the next generation of the colonials, who were often referred to as the rising generation. They often talked about the rising generation. Sort of given up on the first generation, the convicts, Aboriginal people, they weren't listening, they weren't interested in the gospel, so let's focus instead on their children. These households were also influenced by current evangelical views of marriage, and we've already talked a little bit about different views of marriage in the past. I want you to try and guess who wrote this quote. They say, "Doubtless this more favourable disposition to religion in the female sex was graciously designed also to make women doubly valuable in the wedded state. And it seems to afford to the married man the means of rendering an active share in the business of life more compatible than it would otherwise be, with the liveliest devotional feelings, that when the husband should return to his family, worn and harassed by worldly cares or professional labours, the wife, habitually preserving a warmer and more unimpaired spirit of devotion than is perhaps consistent with being immersed in the bustle of life, might revive his languid piety." Any guesses who wrote that? It was William Wilberforce. In his influential book, written in 1797, A Practical View of the Prevailing Religious System of Professed Christians, I have to read this because it's too long, in the higher and middle classes in this country contrasted with real Christianity. Most of the time we just call it A Practical View. It was a very influential book, and I think his views of marriage are fascinating here, and it really links in with what Danny was talking about before. First of all, I found it interesting that he talks about women having a more favourable disposition to religion. That, and Danny's already said it, that women are kind of more virtuous by the fact they can be more devoted to the Lord because they don't have to worry so much about the business of the world out there that, Danny was saying was a darker place, but they could be at home devoted to the Lord there. You might be surprised to even think of the idea that women are more godly than men. Certainly this kind of jarred with me that this is what they were teaching. So if a woman marries, then she's actually doing a great service to her husband. And it says here that she is doubly valuable. What an interesting phrase. When I read this, I thought this is quite a lot like a saying I used to hear quite a bit when I was at university, that when a man marries, he can either double or halve his ministry. Have you ever heard that quote? Have a little think about it. It's got some strengths, but also some weaknesses. But it's the kind of attitude that I think that is echoed in William Wilberforce's quote here. So the second point is that obviously there's different roles between the men and women. The husband is caught up in the busyness of life in the world and his labours, the concerns of the world, but the wife is busy with the concerns of the home. So he's out in the world and the woman is at home. The busyness and the problems of the world it talks about the husband being worn out. But then he can come home to his family, which will help him revive his love and his passion for service to the Lord. This idealised view of the wife, especially, as the virtuous one, was extremely influential in the late 18th and going on to 19th century. It became immensely popular, especially through a poem written by Coventry Patmore, who talked about the angel in the house. And this phrase ended up being, it symbolises to historians about the role of women in Victorian England, this idea of the angel in the house that you came home to, the virtuous woman. Going back to the quote, therefore, one of the implications, I think, of this quote is that Christians thought it was highly desirable and probably even necessary for a man to be married if they were going to go out and be a minister or a missionary. Because you need the wife there to support you and to bring her virtuousness to help you. This particular quote goes on and says, "And the religious impressions of both might derive new force and tenderness from the animating sympathies of conjugal affection. Can a more pleasing image be presented to a considerate mind than that religious impressions of both might derive new force and tenderness from the animating sympathies of conjugal affection, than that of a couple happy in each other and in the pledges of their mutual love, uniting in an act of grateful adoration to the author of all their mercies, recommending each other and the objects of their common care." So these are other aspects of evangelical ministry in the 19th century. You can see there this mutuality. So Wilberforce talks about conjugal affection. Conjugal just means, between married people. And mutual love. There is a mutuality and affection in these marriages as they support each other. And this helps both of them to passionately love their Saviour. So their love for each other will help them then love the Lord. The final aspect of marriage, I think, again, comes from this quote. It is children. So when William Wilberforce says the objects of their common care, I think he's talking about children, these objects. Raising godly children was indeed a very important responsibility, and here he's talking about it given to both men and women, a husband and wife. So Wilberforce was really important in shaping Protestant evangelical views of marriage and therefore the household in the 19th century. But there was also another person that was very influential, Hannah More. More was an evangelical woman who began Sunday schools. She wrote many books, tracts, and even plays. She's a fascinating woman. She was involved with the Clapham sect and William Wilberforce in a lot of their campaigns, including the abolition of slavery. In 1808, she wrote a novel called Colebs in Search of a Wife. And it's a novel, it's fiction, but in it she really portrays what she thinks is the ideal wife. There's a character called Mrs. Stanley who says that the ideal wife is someone who manages the household, is educated, she concerns herself with the religious instruction of children, and she does works of charity. So Colebs goes out and he goes and finds this kind of ideal wife for himself. This was written in 1808, and I love this little fact. Its initial popularity was greater than Pride and Prejudice, which was written about the same time. So these two views, William Wilberforce and Hannah More, really portray this idea of evangelical marriage, with the husband focused on ministry outside the home and the wife focused on ministry in the household. But there's a mutuality as they support and work as partners and care for their children. So point number 2, I want to look at the Marsden household. So this is Samuel and Eliza. There they are. Samuel Marsden was the assistant chaplain sent to New South Wales to help the chaplain Richard Johnson there in the colony. The missionary register says that he was expressly formed by Providence to produce a most beneficial change, and not only through the limited tract of New South Wales, but the vast extent of Australasia, to Christianise and civilise, see they're actually using those words, the barbarians. I think that he's talking about the Aboriginal people and also the Indigenous people of the South Seas, that constitute its original inhabitants, and to re-Christianise and re-civilise the hordes of wretched culprits that are vomited by our prison ships upon its shores. They're the convicts. So he was sent over there particularly to do ministry amongst the Indigenous people, Aboriginals in New South Wales, and the convicts. He was sent, as I said before, by William Wilberforce, who had been searching for someone to assist Johnson. And he found in the 28-year-old Samuel Marsden, he found the man. Wilberforce actually later described Marsden to Governor Macquarie as not refined in his notions or manners and never before accustomed to high society. So you see, he was a bit of a earthy kind of guy, maybe a bit like Luther, not sort of high society, he came from a farming sort of background, so he was a bit rough and ready. But Marsden was selected and agreed to this gospel mission in distant lands in January 1793. But first, with this evangelical view of ministry, he realised he needed a wife to assist him. So before he left to New South Wales, he proposed to a friend of his, the 21-year-old Elizabeth Friston. That dress there, I had to put that in. The Powerhouse Museum has all these clothes of the Marsden family. So these incredible things have been preserved. This is actually a day dress that was worn by Elizabeth, or I'm going to call her from now on Eliza, because that's what she came to be known in the colony. Marsden needed a wife, so he proposed to what he called her Betsy, and we even have the proposal. How cool is that? Here it is. Dear Betsy, since my lot is now seemingly cast, and God appears to be opening my way to carry the gospel of his Son to distant lands, the time is come for me to lay open my thoughts to you, which have long been hidden in my own breast. I shall venture to submit to your consideration the following important questions, praying at the same time that the Lord would enable you to answer it agreeable to his own will, and in such a way conduce your happiness to mine. The question is this: will you go with me? If upon considering the subject you answer in the affirmative and say, I am willing, then my heart, as far as it is proper, I should give to the creature, and all I have are yours. I believe it be for my good and his glory. He will provide me with a helpmate. And if not, he will give me a mind resigned to his will. So maybe she won't say yes. I persuade myself I should be happy in the enjoyment of you more than any other. Yet I do not wish to purchase my own peace at the expense of your comfort, but only if you think you would be happy. Then I cheerfully offer my hand and my heart whenever you please. I remain, dear Betsy, yours most affectionately, S. Marsden. What a great proposal. We can see here Marsden was looking for a helpmate, which is an interesting phrase. A companion who would support him in his ministry and missionary ventures, and he found this in Eliza. She accepted his proposal and was willing to support his missionary vocation, even though that meant a real sacrifice on her part. She was leaving behind her family and friends, all her support structure, to get on a ship for 8 months to travel to the Antipodes, where she knew no one. All they would have known about was the convicts and the Aboriginals, the middle of nowhere. It was a huge sacrifice. But she was willing to take on that missionary opportunity, and she was indeed the helpmate that he longed for. She was a very sympathetic companion, and later he called her his most valued counsellor. A very happy marriage. So, their marriage was a very happy one. It provided that support and companionship, and family life was a really comfort for both of them in New South Wales, especially because there were very few evangelical families there. Marsden wrote to a friend back in England. When he settled in Parramatta, he said, "I have great reason to be thankful that I am happy in my own family. I believe few more so. I should have been wretched and miserable here without a wife. Now I am happy and comfortable." He believed that the support of Eliza was indispensable to his ministry. And later, when Eliza dies at the age of after 42 years of marriage, she wasn't 42, it was 42 years of marriage, Marsden himself was stricken. He wrote, "The wound will never heal this side of the grave." And for the first time, he felt his courage leave him in the pulpit. He missed, he said, the unity and love they had shared, as well as her faithfulness as a warm friend to all the missionaries. So their marriage was very much a partnership, but also a lot of mutual affection and support. What about their family life? Samuel and Eliza were to have 8 children, and it was Eliza's main role to care and nurture all these children and give them religious instruction so they would grow up to be faithful servants of the Lord. This little outfit was an outfit that was worn by John, their son John, at the age of 2. Eliza also managed the household, and this was no mean task because Samuel Marsden, especially as his business interests grew, there was a lot of farming, gardening, a lot of home care that she needed to do, especially in the many times that Samuel was away doing his ministry. Eliza's first child, Anne, was actually born on their ship as they went out to New South Wales. As I said before, it took 8 months to get there, and Eliza got on the boat pregnant. She had no help except for Samuel to help her deliver the baby, which in that day and time must have been, almost shameful for a man to have to deliver a baby. And Samuel said it was in this huge storm. The storm waves were coming over while she was giving birth and onto the child and all over all their bedding. But he says her mind was quite easy and she appears in a fair way to do well. Incredible. The Marstons settled in Parramatta once they got to New South Wales. This is the house, eventually a very grand home, that the Marstons lived in. Marsden actually ended up becoming the 4th richest man in the colony because of his extensive farming. The older children in the family were sent back to England for their education, including the girls. And that's interesting in itself, that it was very important for the girls to be educated so that they themselves might be suitable helpmates like Eliza was for Samuel. And also to be able to to give the children, their own children, the religious instruction that they needed. While the children were sent to England, often they were, Anne went at the age of 6, so very little. And Eliza really keenly felt that separation. There are also many griefs that the Marsdens suffered, and they lost 2 children. So the first was a 3-year-old, Charles Simeon. He died when he was thrown out of a carriage, and here Eliza recounts the tragedy to her friend Mrs. Stokes. She says, "You have no doubt heard what an affliction we have been visited with in the melancholy death of our dear little boy. We were going to a farm and the servant was driving him and me in a single chaise. Mr. Marsden was on horseback when a man 20 yards from our own home carelessly run a wheelbarrow directly under the wheel of the chaise and overturned it. My dear child never stirred more." He actually died in his mother's arms. She says, though, at the end, "I was wonderfully supported and had one consolation that the world cannot ever take away. He who is faithful has promised, when thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers they shall not overflow thee. God is a refuge and strength, a very present help in time of need." Tragedy. Then the second tragedy, this is getting really sad, isn't it? I'm sorry. Another son, John, also died. So he was the little outfit that we saw earlier. He died at the age of 2. He was scalded in the family kitchen with a pot of boiling water. And the grief that Eliza felt after his death was even more terrible than before. She says, "The loss of those I have parted from weighs so much on my mind. At times I am as miserable as it is possible to be. Outwardly I may appear cheerful, but I am very far from being happy. Indeed, happiness and me seem long to have parted, and I have a presentiment that peace will never more be an inhabitant of my bosom." As well as the loss of 2 children, another son is Charles Simeon II. So they named their next son the same name as their first son. He was a great concern to his parents. They sent him over to England to be educated, but he abandoned his studies, and when he returned, he had a lot of debts. He never seemed to ever sort of settle in work or in any kind of sort of service of the Lord, so we kind of guess perhaps he wasn't a Christian. He was the wayward son of the Marsdens. But Eliza and Samuel in their family certainly nurtured the faith of their children. Eliza's background was Methodist, and as well as going along to the church service in the Church of England every Sunday and hearing Marsden, her husband, preach, and also leading her children in their devotions, Eliza took the children every week to the Methodist meeting that happened in Roland Hassall's house, nearby at Parramatta. So the 2 families even worshipped together during the week, the Marsden family and the Hassall family. The Marstons also invited 2 Aboriginal children into their family, though the way that these Aboriginal children were viewed would frankly to be abhorrent to a 21st century worldview. But as I said before, the evangelical vision at the time was to civilise and convert. And so this was their goal with these Aboriginal children. They wanted to bring to the Indigenous people the benefits of British civilisation. So things like clothes and manners, to get them to build houses, to farm and work. So that the idea of British culture would be a great benefit to the Indigenous people, so both civilise and convert them. And in fact, Samuel thought that you had to civilise a person before you can then evangelise them. The first Aboriginal boy they gave a British name to, they named him Tristan. Eliza said it was her duty to civilise him and hopefully prepare him to be a servant in the colony. She wrote to her friend, "I have also a little native boy who takes up part of my attention. He's about 6 years old and now begins to read English and wait at the table. And I hope at some future period he may be a useful member of society. He has no inclination to be among the natives and has quite forgotten their manners." So she's really pleased at his progress. But Eliza's care for Tristan came to a very abrupt end during the Marsden's journey back to England in 1807. Tristan was 13 and he had become addicted to alcohol. Samuel punished him when he realised that he was, drinking so much on the ship. And when they landed at Rio de Janeiro on their way back to England, Tristan took off. He ran away. Eliza said his master punished him and he ran off. The fact that she referred to this Aboriginal boy as a servant and Samuel as his master seems to reflect, I think, the different attitude that Eliza had to these adopted children than to her own children. Samuel Marsden and Eliza also adopted another Aboriginal child who's nameless. And again, this is going to disturb you. Samuel Marsden said, "I have found something very peculiar in the Aboriginal constitutions and affections. I think it's hardly possible to attach them to our habits, customs and friendships. I found it to be the case with the two that I attempted to civilise. One of my boys was taken from his mother's breast and brought up with my children for 12 years. Taken from his mother's breast. It's very disturbing, isn't it? But Marsden's experience with these two Aboriginal boys really shaped his attitude towards the Aboriginal people. It's kind of cemented in his mind that the Indigenous people could not be civilised and therefore they couldn't be converted. And he gave up trying to evangelise them and did no ministry among them. So he really focused his ministry to the convicts. So what ministry did the household do? This is St John's Parramatta, his church. As I said before, Samuel was the second Church of England chaplain. He was also a magistrate and over time a wealthy farmer. Initially, he was given little help from the governor, Governor Macquarie, earlier he was given no help from the governor at the time to build church or to do ministry. In fact, there was no church there for many years, which is very frustrating to Samuel and Eliza. And Eliza saw this as a lack of care for both ministers of the gospel and Christian faith. As well as preaching, Samuel also ran a school in his own house with the help of Eliza. And finally, in 1803, after many years of ministry, his church, St John's Parramatta, was opened and services began. The ministry in New South Wales with Samuel Marsden was soon boosted by the arrival of some missionaries. These were missionaries from the London Missionary Society, including Roland Hassall. They had fled from Tahiti because they were in fear of their lives and settled in Sydney and New South Wales. The missionaries were welcomed by Samuel Marsden, even though they were Methodists and Congregationalists, as long as they were to focus their ministry on the settlers and be educators and evangelists, while he was the Church of England minister and chaplain and had particular ministry vocation to the convicts and to the military. Roland Hassall and his wife Elizabeth and their children became really close friends with Samuel Marsden and Eliza Marsden and their children. They lived in Parramatta together. As I said before, the Marsdens and Hassalls were particularly concerned with the rising generation. He said the only prospect for a minister's usefulness in the colony was the rising generation, because he had very little success in civilising or converting their parents, the convicts or the Aboriginals. He was very concerned about the lack of good schools in the colony and wanted to care for the young. He was particularly concerned for young girls in the colony. And you would probably know that the colony was very much a colony of men. And young girls were in danger of being prostituted in the colony. And he thought corrupted by their convict parents. So Marsden was involved in the establishment of an orphan school for young girls in 1800. And he was also very involved later in the Sunday school that Thomas Hassall established in 1815 and invited the Sunday school into his church at St John's, Parramatta. He also advocated back to England, and this is the reason actually they were headed back to England when Tristan ran away, to advocate to William Wilberforce and to the English government to send more teachers, more educators, more ministers to care for the rising generation. But Marsden's most effective ministry was actually not in New South Wales but in New Zealand. He made 7 voyages to New Zealand to evangelise the Maori population and to set up schools and churches. At the last journey when he was 70 years old. And this ministry was really gratifying to him because they were much more open to his vision of ministry. They were much more open to British civilisation and British culture, and there was a lot more conversions amongst the Maori. In his ministry to the Maori, he thought again about the rising generation. He set up a seminary back in Parramatta in 1819 for young Maori chiefs. Unfortunately, 13 of them died because of disease, no doubt brought by the white men. But undeterred, in 1823, he went ahead and reopened the seminary, the school, for the children of the Maori chiefs, and as well as the children of missionaries. So again, this desire to educate, to convert, to help grow the rising generation. Eliza was also very involved in supporting the missionaries who, some of them went back to Tahiti and other parts of the South Seas. They would come back to New South Wales, I guess on what we would call times of furlough, to have to be refreshed and to get resources before they went back out to Tahiti. Eliza provided hospitality to them and a place to stay. She prayed for them and encouraged, especially the missionary wives. For example, in a letter to Mrs. Holt, she said, "Let me, my dear creature, entreat you to love your husband, serve your Lord Jesus, fill with you station in which you are placed, and adorn the gospel in all things, so that your praying may not be in vain." Now, it's very easy for historians to sort of glorify, especially for us, Samuel Marsden was such a significant man in the foundation of the Anglican Church, but he was a very difficult man. If any of you have read, there's a new book come out by John Harris, which is called Judging the Macquaries, and it really does not paint Samuel Marsden in a good light. He was at many times extremely cantankerous and hard to get on with. Particularly his relationship with Governor Macquarie completely blew up, and he took Macquarie to court. He was often conniving and, I would say from this book, even dishonest, despite all his good ministry. But at the same time, all the evidence points to a very happy marriage and also great relationships, particularly with his daughters and wife. His biographer, Yarwood, describes him as a man who is not slow to anger, but quick to see those around him as unreasonable and wicked men. There's no doubt that these attributes of his personality probably interfered, you can imagine, with his ministry, especially to the convicts, who really frustrated him because they wouldn't do what he wanted them to do. And perhaps you've heard of his nickname, which is the flogging parson. So he was quite harsh in the way he punished them. But he had, at the same time, a wonderful legacy of ministry, him and his household. The second household I wanted to talk to you about is the Hassall household. And I'm not going to speak as long about them, by the way, so hope you don't feel exhausted. This is the Hassall household. So this is Thomas Hassall, the son of the missionary Roland Hassall. He marries Anne Marsden. So the oldest child of Roland Hassall marries the oldest child of Samuel Marsden. We have no picture of Anne, hence the beautiful dress. But again, this is held in the Powerhouse Museum and is indeed a day dress of Anne Marsden, who came to be Anne Hassall. I really love Thomas and Anne, and especially for their work in establishing the first Sunday school, because I work for YouthWorks. Thomas was born before his parents left for Tahiti, and we have this wonderful picture when they were in Tahiti. He is the little boy, I don't know if you can see him, so I'll have to come over because I've got no pointer. Oh, sorry, Dan. This is him there, and there's his mother and father and his little brother, Samuel Otto. So that's them. They're evangelising to the Tahitians. So he was born to this missionary family, and Roland and his wife Elizabeth were to have 7 more children. This is the Hassall clan that Thomas was a part of. I've already told you that the Marsden and Hassall families were very, very close in Parramatta. And in 1822, when Thomas returned from England from his studies, Anne and Thomas were married. It seemed really fitting that the 2 key evangelical families in New South Wales were joined together in this marriage. And I have a great treat for you. This is Anne Marsden's wedding dress. Again, that is still there in the Powerhouse Museum. Thomas Hassall grew up with the same sort of missionary heart that his father did. And I have to tell you now about the ministry of the Sunday schools, because even before their marriage, Anne and Thomas were both involved in the Sunday school movement. Thomas later told the story of the Sunday school. He wrote it up as a children's book that he then published so that children could read about it. When he was 19, he met a sailor boy called Jemmy. He met Jemmy in Sydney, and Jemmy was working, Thomas was working in the merchant ship business, and Jemmy was a sailor boy. Jemmy couldn't read. He was an Irish Catholic, so Thomas taught him how to read, and it was on the only time that they were both available, which was between 9 and 10 o'clock on a Sunday night. I'd be exhausted by 9 or 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, but that's when they did it. Eventually, he taught Jemmy how to read, and Jemmy was able to read the New Testament. So he must have been a very clever boy. And Thomas says that his mind evidently unfolded and a new light burst upon his soul. So Jemmy was converted. He began to go to church and to chapel and grew in his Christian faith with the help of Thomas. Jemmy, I guess the example of Jemmy, and also the example of Robert Raikes, who set up the first Sunday school back in England, well, promoted anyway the idea of Sunday schools in England, inspired Thomas to then set up a proper Sunday school in Parramatta. It began in the Hassall's house, and his father, Roland, helped him to do the teaching there, as did the older Hassall children, so his brother Samuel and his sister Mary. And the Marsden girls also helped. So Anne Marsden, Elizabeth and Mary all helped in the teaching of the Sunday school together. So I'm just imagining all these beautiful young adults all doing ministry together, these 2 households. Here is the banner of the first Sunday school in Parramatta. It's made of silk and it's in the State Library. So you can see Parramatta up the top, Sunday schools, down the bottom it's 1815. On the left there is a medal that was often given out to Sunday school children if they passed a certain examination. And it's given to, you'll see it's Anne Hassall. So it's Thomas's teenage sister who had gone through the Sunday school. Thomas had this grand vision to reach thousands of children with the gospel and to bring about conversion and civilization, he believed, to the world through the Sunday schools. This was his vision in a speech back in England. He said, "Has not the glimmering of the Sun Schools exertion reached the most distant parts of the world, even to the Antipodes itself? And shall we not fan it into flame that shall not enlighten the Christian, but the heathen world?" So the Sunday schools were going to bring light to both the Christian world and also to Aboriginal, Maori, Indigenous peoples too. So the children of Roland and Samuel continued their vision to civilise and convert the rising generation, particularly by teaching them to read, and therefore teaching them to read the Bible and religious instruction. Thomas's mentor was Samuel Marsden. So Samuel really brought Thomas under his wing, and Samuel Marsden talked about Thomas as his Timothy. He really encouraged Thomas to go to England to be trained and therefore to be ordained as a Church of England minister. And so in 1817, Thomas got on the ship to go to England. But the Marsden girls and the Hassall children all got together and they continued the work of the Sunday school while Thomas was away. And wrote to him often and sent him some of her mother's preserves and pickles. I'm sure they had them in England, I'm not exactly sure, but it was obviously an act of love. She spoke of her great desire to see him again, and she said that she fervently wished that she would see him this side of eternity. While he was away, she worked very hard in the Sunday school, and she asked Thomas, "Is there any particular child that you would like me to keep my eye on, or family that you would like me to visit?" She was also involved in raising money for the Bible Society, which had just been established. And she talked about the Sunday school to Thomas, saying there's 110 now children that can attend constantly. And that included Aboriginal children. She said the little black children make rapid improvement. The girls can read fluently and write and sew very neatly. When Thomas returned to New South Wales in 1822, he married Anne. Samuel Marsden was absolutely delighted, and the children of the first generation were now forming their own households and would serve the Lord together as evangelicals. This is what Samuel Marsden wrote to the CMS. He said, "The Reverend Hassall, that's Thomas, is well and promises to be a very faithful and useful minister of the gospel. He was married to my oldest daughter about a month ago, as they are both pious and have for years walked in the fear of the Lord. I hope they'll be a blessing to the colony when my labours are ended. A generation is rising up to serve the Lord. It is no small satisfaction to me when I see my son-in-law and my daughter ready to take my place should I be removed." Their family, Anne and Thomas raised a large family in New South Wales. Let me remind you, there was no contraception at this time. So all the families are large. Here are the children of Anne and Thomas. Many of the girls, the Hassall girls, were married into ministerial and missionary families, and at least two of their children had very important ministries themselves. The two that we know about the most was James Hassall, who became a pioneering minister, and another really significant person is Eliza Marsden Hassall. So you see there, she's the second last child. Eliza Marsden was always a single woman, and in her ministry she assisted her father in his churches. She was also the one who established the New South Wales branch of the Scripture Union. This union distributed membership cards to people who wanted to become members and had daily Bible readings for the children. She was a really fantastic ministry-minded woman. She was also the founder and first principal of Marsden House. I'd never heard about this before today. Oh, you know, Joan. It's a training school for women missionaries that was established at Ashfield. And she taught New Testament and other subjects to the women who wanted to become missionaries. I think this is a really interesting development as we look at the ministry that women had in the colony. So you'll see the evangelical vision from Wilberforce was very much that a woman should look to marriage, and that was really her main role, was to support the ministry of her husband. Now we're getting to a time where there are many single women who become missionaries, and Eliza Marsden is actually teaching them the Bible to go out and be missionaries. And in the second half of the 19th century, 70% of the evangelical missionaries were women, single women. So it's, incredible numbers. But back to Thomas and Anne and now their ministry. When Thomas returned from England, he was not given a position for 18 months. So Samuel Marsden had to support the family and gave him a ministry as his curate, and gave them financial support. Thomas and Anne then went to serve at a pioneering church in Port Macquarie and then another pioneering church in Bathurst. Finally, he began a church at Cobbitty. His property was called, I don't know how to pronounce this, Denby, in Cobbitty, and the church was actually on, his property's grounds. This house is still there. You've been there? Oh, there you go.
It's still like the servant bell was up.
Oh, wow.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I haven't been there. And this was the church at Cobbitty. This is where he did his ministry for the rest of his life. From Cobbitty, it was a fair way out in New South Wales sort of times, in where the settlers were sort of spread out through New South Wales. And from here, he visited pioneer families, and he wasn't the flogging parson, he was the galloping parson, because he was always on his horse, galloping here, galloping there. Particularly the Methodist labouring farmers really appreciated his ministry. They didn't have a minister of their own, but he went out to different places, did gospel preaching, baptised the children, and he gave the Methodists he and Anne gave them great hospitality back in their home at Denby. So you see those big verandas. They used to have Methodist meetings out there on the veranda. We don't know very much about Anne's ministry, but Thomas's ministry was praised and appreciated by everybody. At his funeral, it was a huge funeral, many people gathered. There were many people who'd been converted by his ministry or encouraged in their faith. It's said in the obituary, many people who he didn't even realise he had been significant to in their conversion. The obituary says they were gathered from all quarters, from families of the young, and he loved children, from the cottages of the poor, from the houses of the rich, from the sick bed, from the condemned cell. The salvation of souls through the cross of Jesus was his ambition. Anne was there in his final illness, we know, even though we don't know much else about her ministry. And presumably she was running the household and the farm and all the other things while he was galloping around. She raised her children to be godly Christians and managed the household. So, what kind of conclusions can we make by studying these two households? I think, as Danny has warned us, we need to understand them in the context of their day. They are historically contingent. There's a danger amongst historians, I think, to argue that was means should. that because households operated in this way in the past, our households should operate in this way today. But that is a mistake to make. Certainly there are lots of things about this ministry practices that we might critique, particularly the evangelical vision to civilise first and then convert. When we see the treatment of the Aboriginal people within these lenses, we know that it was incredibly destructive. And certainly it took decades until the gospel took fruit amongst Aboriginal people. Yet there are fascinating things, I think, that we can learn from these households that may help us to think about ministry in our context. First of all, I think it's really interesting to think about the role of women in the household and in ministry. The role of the woman was particularly a supportive one, focusing on the home and the family and her children. As we saw before with Samuel and Eliza, she was to be a helpmate, a support and companion, a friend to her husband. She was expected to keep an ordered and peaceful household and to welcome many into her home with her hospitality. This was a general evangelical vision that was taught, we saw, by Wilberforce and Moore and other evangelicals. But I think to the next generation, not being married, being a single woman, became less of a tragedy for a woman. And in fact, being a single woman could give them opportunities for ministry, such as being a missionary, that a married woman didn't have the freedom to do. And I think we see this in the wonderful life of Eliza Marsden Hassall. The second conclusion I want to make is that ministry is facilitated by godly households, and this should encourage those people here that have children. Parents were incredibly important figures in their household, and part of their responsibility was to nurture their children and give them religious instructions so they could grow up as Christians. It's a really important ministry that they had. And as the children grew, the household did ministry together, and we saw that beautifully in the Sunday school with all the children working together to do this ministry. As the households grew, they encouraged each other, they supported each other, they returned home for prayer and for support as the whole family did ministry together. Thirdly, I noted the significance of children's ministry. So this idea of the rising generation. It was not just their own children that the Marsdens and Hassalls were concerned about, but it was the children of the colony, the rising generation. They realised how important it was in this pioneering society to have a new generation of Christians, to raise up Christian people who would keep on the ministry, the gospel ministry in the colony, and who would be leaders in society to shape the new society that was emerging in New South Wales. So a lot of their ministry was actually focused not on adults, but on children and young people. Finally, I'm really struck by the significance of family history. Now, I'm a historian, but generally I don't love family history. So when my mum dragged me around cemeteries to look at gravestones of her ancestors, I really didn't have a good time. But Stuart Piggin has said in lectures and in books that evangelical history really has to really think about family history as well. And, there's a reason why I gave you those great lists of all the children. Family history shows you that the gospel is passed down from generation to generation. It's the passing down of the faith and of the evangelical tradition. So before the Hassall family became a dynasty going on, that maintained their evangelicalism over generations. So to sum up, my personal takeaway from this research has been to admire the self-sacrificial ministry of these households, and especially for me, the women. Too often this ministry is overlooked by historians, and the focus is too often on the ministry of men. My other takeaway has been the ongoing importance of children's ministry. It's so important, I think, to pass our faith down to the next generation. Yeah.